Hello and welcome to another episode of Adventures in .net. I'm Sean Clebo, your host, and with me today we have our best co-host, Mark Miller.
I made it. I made it to the top. I'm the winner.
Well, I could, yeah, Adam, and can't watch this.
Yeah, don't tell Adam about this part.
Yeah, yeah, or Christian, I guess. Yeah, they're all in the vying, but just this week you're the best.
That's right. Well, I'm the best co-host, everybody.
Okay, let's introduce our guest today. Let's welcome Rockford Lhotka. Welcome, Rocky.
Hey, glad to be here. Good to
Hey.
see y'all.
So it sounds like you and Mark know each other.
We do. We've known each other for many, many years, both being speakers and variety of other places that we've crossed paths over the years in the .NET or Microsoft space.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sean says that to everybody who knows me. Rocky.
Man, oh man, and a few years ago, when they still lived in the Northeast, we had the opportunity to go visit them at their home at the time. That was before they all went and became globetrotting adventurers, and I have enjoyed following all of that over time too. It's all the cool places to go live, and yeah, very neat, very neat.
Great, that's awesome. Why don't you start us off by giving us kind of an introduction to yourself? You know how you got into development, how you get into .NET.
Sure. Yeah, I got into development. Well, as you can see from some of the gray hair, I've been doing this for a while. So I started, and I have friends that will laugh, but I started on the deck vacs uh, back in the late 1980s. And I really liked the VMS, Open VMS operating system. But you get into the 90s and, the PC uh, was starting to become a thing. And um, so I was trying to figure out, well, if I'm going to use PCs, if I'm being forced to at the time, because back then, it was DOS and there wasn't virtual memory or any of the modern computing assets that we think of today, or that we enjoyed on the VAX at the time. And but Windows NT came out. What was that? 91, I want to say 90, and also Visual Basic came out right around that same time. And so that's where I really started into the Microsoft space, and wrote some books and did a lot of work in a lot of different industries in the VB era, and then got into .NET, of course, and that carries us up to today in a way. I guess I've spent, uh, geez, over 25 years, maybe 27 in consulting in different roles, either as a consultant or a manager or executive. Uh, and where I work now is for Xebia Xspirit, the Microsoft focused part of a company called Xebia. And I joined that company about a year ago. Um, and it's been a lot of fun doing all sorts of cool cloud based, this and that's. And, but then also for the last 26 years, something like that, 27, I've been the kind of creator and primary maintainer of an open source project called CSLA, and that's also been a lot of fun.
Wow, I mean, with that many years of experience in the area and in .NET things like that, sounds like you probably have a lot of things to talk about. But I think we're probably going to focus mostly on CSLA today. Sound
Oh,
good?
that works for me. I always like talking about CSLA.
Okay. Well, start us off. Give us an overview of what CSLA is.
Yes, like I said, CSLA is over 27 years old, and uh, so it's undergone some major changes, from back in the COM days and into the .NET days. But at its heart, it's a home for business logic. And what I mean by that is that we've got all of these frameworks from Microsoft or others to create different kinds of user interface, user experience. And it's like today, you might pick Blazor or ASP.NET Razor Pages or Maui, or a lot of people still use Xamarin. Uh, yeah, all these different WPF, UI frameworks, right? And also over all these years, we've had a lot of different frameworks to talk to our, especially SQL databases. Um, and that's not always been a good thing, right? It's like a lot of churn for very little gain as you go from DAO to RDO to ADO.net and all, all this stuff. Um, but the point is that I've always believed that there are three key components to especially enterprise apps, right? There's this user experience part, and obviously you have to talk to your data store, your database, and there's always a lot of business logic. And there's no framework. Uh, well, there is. Yeah, there is. There's CSLA, but that's what CSLA is trying to do: is provide this framework to create reusable, maintainable business logic, and bring business logic up to the same level as UI frameworks or data access frameworks.
So it's a framework on a framework.
Well, yeah, all these things sit on top of .NET, right?
Right. Yeah. So, why would somebody want to use CSLA, versus just going, they're probably just, writing straight code to Razor Pages or Blazor or something like that today, and then writing a just
Mhm.
their own little business layer, you know, then going out to data layer to talk to SQL.
I think the key is that most people, if we're blunt, don't build their own business layer. They put all their business logic in a controller or in a view model, or in click events behind a Blazor button, or click events behind. I mean, this goes all the way back uh, to the early '90s with Visual Basic, when there was, this predates at least us having access to object-oriented technology, and we would just all put our business logic in lost focus events and click events, and uh, that that pattern has continued to this day, where basically if you're doing a razor page, the quote unquote click event is your postback, and people just write all their code there. There's no separation of concerns, there's no isolation between the UI and the business logic, and that's why you have probably almost everybody or every organization is stuck maintaining Windows Forms apps right now today, and they can never get off it because all their business logic is intertwined hopelessly with the UI logic. And that specifically is the problem that CSLA solves. Is it pulls the logic out into its own layer.
Yep, you're definitely talking to me here because I, have a legacy .NET from Web Forms application that I deal
Yep,
with, and yeah,
yep.
being able to strip things out and componentize and get the different layers there is just not an easy task. So a lot of it just sits there, and it's like, well, it works. I'm not going to try to move it, otherwise I'll break it.
Yeah. Right. There's basically no hope, right? It's complete rewrite. And when you rewrite it, barring something to help you get this separation of concerns, almost everybody, when they do their rewrite, ends up writing their code in a controller or a view model or just in click events behind the pages. So
Rocky, I know nothing about CSLA other than I know the acronyms and I remember I've spoken to you about CSLA and heard you talk about it for I want to say almost 20 years. Um, but I'm interested in a a slice of what's inside. Kind of almost I'm getting at a slice of beautiful architecture, something that you really like inside that you can maybe give us an example of some in terms of uh, benefits for decoupling, pulling the business logic out, and keeping it in, that sort of
mhm.
thing, right? Is there something that comes to mind about the architecture that you'd like to talk about that you that you find particularly valuable or that your customers find really valuable?
Yeah, there's probably two big things. So I'm going to pick the one that I think impacts the most people, and that is, although CSLA has a rules engine and really is designed around the creation of business rules, in order to streamline its use, um, it also abstracts the differences between data binding across all the different UI frameworks that Microsoft has. And at a simple level, a lot of folks aren't aware of the deep, utterly maddening complexities that exist there. Um, and but way back with Windows Forms and web forms, but especially Windows Forms, Microsoft defined some data binding interfaces that were not well documented, and Windows Forms used them extensively in one way, and then WPF came along and used them in a different way. And because they were not well documented, they're like, yeah, we could do whatever we wanted, and uh, and then web forms kind of used them a little bit. MVC kind of used them a little bit. Silverlight used them in a way that was similar to WPF, but not the same. Now we get into Blazor. Blazor actually doesn't require any of those interfaces at all because of the way that it does data binding. And so CSLA behind the scenes is aware of which UI environment you're running in on the client device and attempts as best as we've ever been able to figure out how to optimize for the different UI bindings in order to avoid UI refreshes in some cases, but then in other cases to make sure the refresh actually happens when you think it will. Uh, and so part of the again part of the goal is that if you write your business logic in this separate layer, that you should be able to basically tear off your existing UI and slap on a new UI with a different technology, primarily using data binding and hopefully minimal UI code. And this was not my purpose. This is not what I set out to do when I built CSLA, but I gotta say this is the part of CSLA that has consumed by far the most time and energy over the years is dealing with all the data binding idiosyncrasies. So from a business, from your value as a consumer of CSLA, if you've got a Windows Forms app that's built on CSLA, for example, you should be able to just write a Blazor UI, as an example, on top of that same DLL. And CSLA is like, oh, great, now we're running in Blazor, and it changes some of the way that uh, the data binding interfaces and events are managed to be optimized for Blazor. So,
So data binding with regards to UI, for example, in WPF, there's this declarative uh, syntax that's happening inside the XAML.
mhm.
And I would imagine that I have to step away from that and I put that somewhere else. Is that true? I have data binding is in the code, or
No,
no?
no.
So
Ideally, you continue to bind the XAML binds to your what are called a domain object. So CSLA is also an object-oriented framework. So when you're creating this business, all your business rules are wrapped in what are called domain classes or domain objects, right? And those should be designed using uh, well, kind of something akin to domain-driven design. They should be designed to support the UI, right? Which is the same. It's basically all designed around supporting a user scenario, and that is, that's basic object-oriented design 101, right? And so your UI is designed with storyboards. Your objects are designed to support the same user scenario, um, and your business rules then are encapsulated in those classes. And so, yeah, when you think about it from like a XAML perspective, you're binding this domain object directly to the UI using XAML binding. But that's the goal, right? Is to be able to natively tap into XAML binding, Blazor binding, whatever. So the UI developer doesn't have to learn new things, right? And underneath it, the business rules and everything else are just automatically running and doing their job.
So if I'm like Sean and I've got, the situation that he described, which is a mess, I'm gonna say.
Thanks.
Sorry,
That's
Sean.
my guess. It's my guess based on how Sean's talking about it.
I
Do
inherited
I?
it. I'll
And
say I inherited it. Yeah,
okay, that's
that's
good.
it.
That's good. But by the way, the messes I create are generally not inherited by any. I didn't get those from anyone. I make my own messes. They're
Mm.
all over the place. But if I have a this kind of event driven kind of business logic, and I want to take a step in the direction of decoupling, is there a place, does CSLA help with that? And if it does, like what's your advice if I do take a step in that direction? Or and if it doesn't, is it, I guess it sounds like the answer is I want to use it for a brand new project, maybe. And that's how I step into it. How would I step into it if I wanted to learn more? Would I take an existing one and try to port it a bit at a time, or would I try a brand new project? What do you recommend? What's your take
It
on that?
it's yeah, that's a trick. No doubt that CSLA is not intended to be a modernization tool. And really, that's what you're asking for, I think, in that context, is to say, hey, I've got this crufty legacy web forms thing. Um, and I want to modernize that app, and I want an easy path to modernize. And that is a problem for way smarter people than me. Yeah,
Yeah,
um, so on one hand, I could answer, and some, I think it's a valid answer to say that if you want to start using CSLA, that you could pick that you could pick a page uh, that you're trying to do some maintenance on or something, and you could rewrite that page to use CSLA, and theoretically, slowly over time, as you maintain pages, you might, over many years, slowly, but you're still stuck on web forms, right? And um, so realistically, your goal is probably less to use CSLA, and it's more to get off web forms into something modern like Razor Pages or Blazor. And yeah, CSLA is only going to help you there if you went through all the work to rewrite your existing app to have the separate business layer. And I can't see the business value. I'd have a hard time convincing somebody to do that. You know what I mean? Um, so
yeah,
I think you're
Right.
better off rewriting it in something modern like Blazor, and at the same time using something like CSLA to make it more maintainable into the future by creating that separation of concerns.
So how does somebody get started with CSLA? What's the first thing? Is just install the NuGet package, and then where do they go from there?
Probably go to cslanet.com, which has a link to the GitHub repo. And in the GitHub repo is a samples directory uh, where we maintain samples showing the use of CSLA in all of the different UI frameworks. Uh, and I have some, unfortunately, relatively outdated videos and books that are available. Uh, that's one of my ongoing goals, is to keep updating all that content. Um, I've been recently doing a bunch of, this is a tangent, but a bunch of research, talking to people and reading other people's research and whatnot. And it, I learn primarily by reading blogs or books and then taking stuff. But apparently, I'm in the minority. Most people these days prefer to learn through video. So that uh, is a there you go. And so I'm probably going to be creating a bunch of video content.
I want to drive down this tangent with you, Rocky, because I'm often like I ask a question and Google throws up a bunch of videos for me to watch, and I'm like, no, I just want the answer in text because I can get it faster.
Right.
And I know Google just wants to keep me on their site anyway. They want to keep me on their property. They don't want me to leave and go somewhere else, right? So it's like, come on, Google, just tell me the answer, right?
I don't know. I think we live in the era of TikTok, and um, people have become accustomed to learning things in short, maybe not TikTok short, maybe YouTube short, uh, video content. But I agree. I read very fast, and I like to be able to look at the code and kind of page back. I'll be reading, and I'll page up and down, and be comparing the what the author is saying to the code, and I don't know how to do that in a video context, but apparently, all I'm saying, don't shoot the messenger, Mark. I'm just
My ADHD just does not work well with reading things, whatever. That's why videos works best for me. I'm a visual learner, and so it a, a video seems to keep my attention focused better than a book.
Mhm. And I think from all everything I've been able to gather in the last 2 3 months of like I said, trying to figure out where to go. I think you're on the side of the majority, Sean. But yeah, so back to your question. I mean, how do people get started? Um, Really, the website. There's some resources there, but a lot of it points into the GitHub repo, um, and there are links there to some books and videos that are um, based primarily on CSLA 4, which was a big inflection point. That was uh, that was the point that we introduced what I think of as the modern rules engine. CSLA over the years has had a couple different rules engines, and the current one is based on a concept from a guy named David West, who wrote a book. He was a professor of computer science, maybe still is, I don't know. But he wrote a book called Object Thinking uh, back in the, I suppose, late 90s. I don't know, a long time ago. Fantastic book, though, to this day. And one of the concepts in there is this idea of having a rule be an object or a class, and uh, which is super powerful because when you if a rule is a class, then a rule by itself can be unit tested. So you can establish to high confidence that this rule works. And then in the context of CSLA, you attach that rule to a property, or well, one or more properties. Um, and then that's part of what CSLA does is it makes those rules run at the appropriate point based on the life cycle of the object and also when the property changes, that sort of thing. And so, uh, you still probably need to do some integration testing, but just the fact that you've tested the rules, gives you some high confidence that when you attach it to a property, that it's going to do the right thing.
Is there anything that assists with like testing, like test code generation? I feel like we're getting close to, if we have the rule in a class, that there might be something there with regards to connecting it up to a test in terms of declaring what's expected, declaring how the rule is expected to behave given particular inputs, or yeah, it's just something like that. Is there anything
But
with testing or no?
uh, not like you're describing. That sounds like a great idea, though. Uh,
I'm
oh,
filled with I'm filled with ideas that are unimplemented. Rocky, that's all I do.
over the years, yeah, I mean, CSLA has evolved along with, I think, kind of the Microsoft tech stack and the expectations of the community, um, and my knowledge, and but so back at its origin, unit testing was barely a thing in the mid '90s, and that was not a high priority. The high priority was rapid application development and iterative. Back then, it was the F5 debugging development, and but it's directly analogous to what most web developers enjoy, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, I just update my page, save something and hit F5 in the browser, and I get to test it. That what does Microsoft call it? The inner loop, right? The developer inner loop. But over the last probably 15 years, I want to say, we've slowly but surely added a lot of interfaces and uh, other features in CSLA that support easier creation of unit tests, basically. And that I don't know if it culminated. I doubt we're done ever. But CSLA 6, and this was because of Blazor, fully embraced dependency injection. Uh, and you have to, because Blazor fully embraces dependency injection, and in order to play with Blazor, you have to also, um, which is all good though. I mean, it was a lot of work, a heavy lift to create that support, but the payoff is definitely there now for sure.
Can you tell us like what you're thinking about for next or for future versions of CSLA? What kinds of places your mind goes to with regards to
Well, I think probably the big one right at the moment, like just within the last 5 minutes, is some sort of support for automated unit test generation. Uh,
where's my agent? I need to talk to somebody right now.
uh, yeah, right at the moment, I have been spending a lot of time because Blazor 8 changed a lot from Blazor 7. And in opt-in ways. I mean, you can still use Blazor now the way you did a month ago. But the new rendering models that are in Blazor, um, to fully exploit them, um, and no offense to the Blazor team at Microsoft because it's an awesome tool, but it feels kind of like this rendering thing is definitely a V1 feature. This what they now call automatic rendering or different render modes, and which means that there's some really big gaps. And so, uh, yeah, I guess this is more the present than the future, Mark. But this is why I've been blogging and really focused a lot on trying to solve some key issues that have opened up with Blazor in .NET 8. That again, with the goal of CSLA being to mitigate these changes so that a business developer doesn't have to think about them. Um, that's so, um, when I look into the future from there, um, yeah, I think then probably the next big thing is to see what, if at all, CSLA can integrate with .NET Aspire. Some of that tooling and capabilities on the server side that's just announced, and of course that's all based loosely on Project Tie and so forth. But there's some pretty cool stuff that I think I'm gonna uh, want to support over the next year or two.
So how does CSLA change the way I code or the code that I write?
Well, I think the big thing is this concept of keeping your business logic separate from your UI logic and also separate from your data access logic. Um, most people, I suspect these days, use Entity Framework, and so they're using an ORM to talk to the database, and that's cool. Um, I personally don't mind Entity Framework, although I use Dapper quite a bit. Not the DAPR, but the original DAPPER, the lightweight ORM. Um, but it does force you to go through a thought process where you say, um, if I'm not just going to write some if then clauses and whatnot behind a button click, um, where do I put that business logic? and the business logic goes in a rule, and the rule goes in your business library and gets connected to your um, business classes. And so there's definitely a learning curve there, because it enforces some level of separation, which is the goal, and enforces some level of structure, in order to provide consistency, right? And so in short, where you might have written in your controller or in a button click event, you might have written a page or two of code to like double check all the rules, or the values the user entered and all that sort of stuff. And then if they're all good, then you call some service to save your data. With CSLA, your button click event or your controller probably is one line of code that tells the business layer that it's time to save the object, and the object itself typically already knows whether it's valid or not. Um, and so if it's valid, then the it ends up calling essentially a service to save itself. Um, and but the that question, are you valid or not, had to be answered by the fact that you've got rules that are running, as the user has been editing the property values.
So this sounds just like interior design.
Well, it's fundamentally based on an N-tier design, absolutely. Right. Yep. I mean, the goal, uh, you know, taking all the fads out of everything, right? Whether it's the Angular web fad or the microservice fad, or whatever it is, taking all the fad out of this stuff. Um, what I believe what most of us want to do is give the user a good, highly interactive, immediate, a user experience that has a sense of immediacy. So as the user is filling out a complex invoicing or order entry form or whatever it is that's part of your business domain, that the user is getting this immediate feedback. Calculations happen right as they tab off because maybe they're a CSR, they're on the phone with the customer. So, like literally, as they're typing, things are being updated, and they're having this highly interactive experience, right? And to do that generally means that we're running code on the client, right? I mean, the old web, is similar to the old mainframe. You'd fill out the form and hit the transmit key. The server would check all the stuff out and then give you a laundry list of what was wrong. Well, none of us like that experience, right? So we transitioned in the web to writing smart client apps using JavaScript or TypeScript or Dart or whatever, um, because we wanted to give the user this great experience. And so CSLA does that by, you have this all your business logic is in this DLL, well, one or more DLLs. And ideally, if your .NET or if your client machine is able to run .NET, so that means using Maui or Blazor, um, every machine can run .NET, on the client device, all the way from your phone up or your watch up to your PC or whatever. So this becomes realistic. And then at the same time, we never ever trust the client device, right? Because if a bad actor has physical access to your device, nothing is safe. I mean, ever. And so that means that that business logic also needs to run on the server. And so again, with CSLA, because this is just a .NET DLL, um, you deploy the same .NET DLL to the server. And part of what CSLA does is it makes sure that when the request from the client, which is probably all correct unless it's a bad actor involved, right? Hits the server, it reruns all the rules just to double check. And then if all the rules are still valid, then we save the data or whatever into the database. And so, yeah, it is a variation on an N tier model for sure. Um, but personally, I get less hung up on am I microservicey or am I N tier, and I get much more concerned about am I creating some piece of software that meets my client requirements, my end user requirements, business requirements. Is it maintainable at an achievable cost over probably a 10 or 20-year time frame? Because that's how long enterprise apps last. Um, and does it require excessive learning of new skills for my developer team? Ideally, the answer there is no, right?
Yeah. Okay, got it. Yeah. So don't use microservices because that's a fad. All right, got
Got it. That's what I said.
it.
I do a lot of talks on how and when to use microservices, and maybe come back at another point and do an interview on that because they're a great tool. Just like a hammer or a screwdriver is a great tool, but if you're uh, trying if your problem needs a hammer and you're using a screwdriver to solve it, that's not going to be great. And here the problem with the microservice fad is, we all got this hammer, and by God, everything looks like a nail. Um, that's that. So yeah, it's a fantastic tool when used in the right circumstance, but not all circumstances are the right circumstance. So
Yeah, it'd be great to have you back on and to talk about that sometime. So, is there anything that we haven't talked about CSLA that our listeners should know?
well, I think the only thing I didn't talk about is why I created it in the first place, which is a little geekier, and it's a feature that is useful. Um, Mark asked this question: what's the feature everybody gets the most value out of, right? And it's definitely the combination of business rules and data binding. But I originally wrote this thing back in the com days, uh, and which it technically didn't look anything like it does today, from tech in terms of the implementation, but the concepts at the time. And I wrote it because I was working with a bunch of folks that were using C++ derivative. This was in the very early days of client server and end tier, back when almost nobody could do it successfully, because the technology was too raw. And they were writing this system using what at the time was a tool called Forte that had this idea that you could hydrate an object graph, so like a sales order with all its line items, um, on, let's say, on the server, and do some work with it, load it with data and whatnot. And then it was what's called a mobile object. And so the object graph would literally move to another physical computer, usually the client workstation where the user was sitting, and they could interact with that object graph. And then when they were done doing whatever they were going to do, then the object graph would often move back to a server to talk to the database again. And the idea being that these object graphs would move to the resources that they needed. So you could think of the database like a resource and the end user like a resource. Um, this caught my imagination, not in small part because the uh, application that these friends of mine were working on uh, was global. And so they had object graphs that were literally bouncing off satellites. And I'm like, I want my software to bounce off satellites too. This sounds cool. Um, and so back in the 90s, this was done with remote OLE automation that later became COM+. Uh, and in the .NET world, it started out with remoting and has gone through WCF and a whole host of different transport technologies. But the point being, at its core, what CSLA does is it supports this concept of mobile objects. Um, and from a business perspective, what it means is that um, you can start building your app in a essentially one or two tier model where maybe everything runs on the same physical device, including the database, or a two-tier model, which isn't so common anymore. Um, but you can switch to a three-tier model without changing any of your code. You just change the configuration so that the objects that used to just stay on one computer now all of a sudden are moving between computers. And uh, this helps address a problem that I've always called the kind of the pit of success, basically in much of my career, especially my early career, I was asked to write apps that, people are like, man, we need this app. We need it now. It only has like 5 screens and, it's temporary. We're only going to use it for like 6 months because the new system is rolling out or whatever. And so you write this app and people like it. And, but you didn't really put a lot of thought into it, right? Architecturally, you just wrote the code, slapdash and maybe built it as a two-tier thing. And um, then like a year or two later, you get these panic calls because your app is not working in Tokyo. And you're like, "What do you mean it's not working?" Number 1, that app was supposed to die after 6 months, and here we are 2 years later. Number 2, what do you mean it doesn't work in Tokyo? It was a, app I wrote for some people in Minnesota. And they're like, "Oh, no, no, it worked so good that we never did roll out the replacement system, and now we're rolling it out globally." And yeah, I know you only wrote it for like 3 concurrent users, but man, we've got 500 concurrent users now, and it is starting to get a little slow.
Nice.
And this has happened to me over and over and over, and I think it happens to a lot of people.
It does. Yep.
And so then what do you do? Well, if you did what I just described, then you go back and you say, "Oh, that app that I wrote for you in like 3 or 4 weeks, now because you've got these big enterprise requirements, distributed, global, blah blah blah. Yeah, it's going to take 2 years to rewrite with a team of 20 people." Right? I mean, that's often what happens. I might be exaggerating, but and the users are like, "What's wrong with you people?" Um, but if you had written it originally with CSLA, um, from the get go, then what you would do is tell them that it's going to be super hard. Tell them it's going to take a couple 3 months. Tell them
Nice.
that you need a raise. Um, and then really what you do is you stand up an application server, change some configuration files, and it's all done. So, I'm not that I'm encouraging like business, what would that be, fraud or something? But um
I think it might be. Let's be careful.
let's be careful. Well, for those old enough to remember Star Trek the original series and Mr. Scott, Scotty always did this though, right?
I need more time.
He's like, "I need more time, I need more time," and yet he would always do it, and he was considered a miracle worker. So my point is actually not to, exploit this as much as you can be perceived as a miracle worker, right? You can be like, "Oh my god, this is gonna be really, really hard," and then you do it, and everybody's like, "Oh, you must be a genius. Here's a promotion." That's the goal.
I'm spending my whole life waiting for somebody to say you must be a genius. I'm working so hard, Rocky. I'm gonna get CSLA right now.
There you
Like,
go.
that's gonna be my path. Next week, Sean, you'll be saying I'm a genius.
All right. Well, I guess on that note, we should move on to picks. All right. Uh, Mark, do you want to start us off with picks?
Okay, on Netflix, there's a show called Bodyguard, and I know a little bit about it. It's got apparently it was like number one show in the UK, and so I started watching this show. I've only seen about halfway through the first episode, but it was tense and compelling. In fact, sufficiently tense and compelling that I realized we couldn't watch it anymore before going to bed because we need to have like a something lighter. My wife and I is a chaser, right? But we were grabbing onto each other like this, watching the first whatever 30 minutes of it. So anyway, I recommend it if you're into thrillers. You want to take a look at it. So far, so good. Bodyguard.
All right. So my pick this week is based upon a recent thing that happened in our area. A couple weeks ago, a farmer was digging a trench in his field and hit a gas line, and
No.
that gas line fed into 3 towns in this area. So there were about almost 40,000 homes without gas. and it was about 5 days that we didn't have gas because the repair took, just a day or so. But when that happens, they then have to go around to everybody's house and turn off all of their gas lines because they have to bleed all the air out of the lines before they can have that gas coming back into the houses. So that total process for 40,000 homes took about 5 days.
Wow.
So we had
Mm.
no hot water, no heat, or anything like that from gas during that time.
So
What
Sean's pick is go without essentials for 5 days.
No.
Mine wins, Sean. Mine wins. Bodyguard is better than yours.
No, my pick is space heaters made by Vornado. So,
Mm.
Okay. Okay.
Vornado makes some nice space heaters. They're affordable. They're quiet. I like that they actually maintain the temperature pretty well. A lot of the cheap space heaters, they have a big like 5 to 10 degree fluctuation before they kick back on to heat back up and things like that. So the Vornado is really nice that they actually, only
Mm.
fluctuate a couple degrees before it says, okay, kick back on and maintain the temperature. So they've worked very well for me in those 5 days.
That sounds harsh. I've been in cases where we've lost power for like a week, and that's just a miserable deal.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if losing power might be a little bit more easy to deal with because you're just dealing with lanterns and flashlights and blankets and things
Mm.
like that. This gas outage was just because it also all the local businesses and restaurants had to shut down too because they couldn't cook. So it
Mm.
was a huge impact. All right, Rocky, do you have something to use as a pick for our listeners?
Yeah, I'm kind of torn. I think I'm going to go with a TV show, and it's not a new one. Um, it was on Netflix, and it's called Longmire. And I'm going to go with it though because when I watched it, I was like, wow, that really reminded me of my father. Um, yeah, not exactly, but pretty close. Longmire is a lawman in Wyoming, pretty much in the modern day, but he's really out of time. Um, yeah, he should have been there like 100 or 120 years ago, and just the way that he uh, did things and worked and thought about things and stuff. It's a great show for one thing. Really enjoyable, if kind of brutal at times. Um, but uh, but I liked it a lot because my father is a lot like that, where he's kind of a man out of time, always living in the modern world, but kind of I think identified more with people from 100 years ago.
Okay, great. So yeah, we'll make sure to put links to CSLA.net in the show notes and also your website, Lodka, Lodka.net.
Yep.
So everybody can get to that. And yeah, if our listeners have questions, want to reach out to the show, they can get me on all of the platforms. I am at .net Superhero. So thanks, Rocky, for coming on the show. It was a great conversation. Nice to get you and Mark back together.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thank you much.
Great.
Thanks, Rocky.
And we'll thank you, and we'll catch everybody else in the next episode of Adventures in .net.